You didn't just meet them, and this wasn't coincidence dressed up as chemistry. Something older than language pulled the two of you into the same emotional orbit. And from the very beginning, your body knew it mattered, even when your mind tried to stay calm. There was a strange familiarity, not excitement exactly, not chaos, but a sense of recognition that didn't need explanation. That's because you weren't placed in their life to entertain them or to be chosen easily. You were placed there to touch a part of their nervous system that had been asleep for a long time. Avoidant people don't move toward connection by accident. Their systems are selective because connection has always come with a cost. Somewhere early on, closeness became associated with overwhelm, obligation, or loss of self, so their brain learned to survive by staying partially out of reach. When you entered their life, you didn't just arrive as a person, you arrived as a signal. Your presence spoke to their body before their logic could catch up. And that's why the connection felt quiet but intense, subtle but undeniable. This is the neuroscience of heartbreak most people never talk about. Sometimes the bond forms not because two people are ready, but because one nervous system recognizes regulation in another and latches on before fear has time to build its defenses. At first, they felt calm around you, and that calm was confusing even to them. There weren't fireworks or dramatic obsession, but there was ease, a slowing down inside their chest that they weren't used to feeling with other people. Their body relaxed without effort. Their breathing softened, and for a moment, they didn't feel like they had to manage or perform. This is important because avoidance systems don't chase intensity, they chase relief. Relief from vigilance, relief from expectation, relief from the constant background tension they carry without realizing it. You became that relief simply by being emotionally steady, by not demanding immediate access or pushing for definition too early. Their nervous system read you as safe before their conscious mind labeled you as important. And that's why the bond formed without grand gestures. This is also why you may have felt something deeper building underneath the surface. Even when nothing dramatic was happening on the outside, safety doesn't announce itself loudly, but it roots itself deeply. And once an avoidant nervous system experiences that kind of regulation, it doesn't forget it easily. Without trying, you became a mirror, and not the flattering kind. You reflected back a version of them they don't usually sit with, the version that can be present, emotionally responsive, and connected without losing themselves. This is where the trouble begins. Being seen at that level feels intimate even without physical closeness, and intimacy threatens the avoidant survival strategy. You didn't just see who they were in that moment, you saw who they could be if they didn't have to keep running from closeness. That kind of recognition carries weight. It asks a question their system isn't prepared to answer. What if connection doesn't destroy me? What if it actually supports me? For someone wired to equate closeness with danger, that question alone is destabilizing. So while you felt like you were gently meeting them where they were, their nervous system was already doing calculations, scanning for risk, preparing escape routes just in case. This doesn't mean they didn't value you. It means you mattered enough to activate their defenses. The connection deepened without being clearly defined, and that ambiguity wasn't accidental. Avoidant attachment bonds often grow in the spaces between labels because labels feel like contracts and contracts feel like traps. They could feel close to you, open up in small, controlled ways, and still tell themselves they had freedom. This is why the bond felt real, but strangely unanchored. You may have noticed moments of emotional depth, followed by casual distance, meaningful conversations paired with a reluctance to name what was happening. That wasn't confusion, it was protection. Their nervous system was trying to keep the door open without letting the walls come down. And you, being attuned and emotionally present, likely adapted without realizing it, holding space for the connection without pushing it into clarity. That adaptation is part of why this heartbreak cuts so deeply later. You weren't just attached to them, you were attached to the possibility you could feel forming between you. Then something shifted, not suddenly, but quietly. The danger wasn't love or commitment in the way people usually think. The danger was consistency. As you continued to show up with the same emotional tone, the same steadiness, the same availability without pressure, their nervous system began to register threat. Consistency removes the illusion of control. It says this connection is real. It's not fading on its own. And at some point, a choice will have to be made. For an avoidant system, that moment triggers a stress response. Their body starts to associate the calm they once felt with the risk of being needed, of being seen, of losing autonomy. Cortisol rises, the urge to create distance grows, and the mind begins to rationalize withdrawal. You may have felt this as a subtle pulling away, a change in responsiveness, a shift in emotional temperature that you couldn't quite explain but couldn't ignore either. This is the beginning of the heartbreak, the point where your nervous system is still leaning in while theirs is quietly preparing to step back. What makes this especially painful is that nothing you did caused this shift. You didn't become too much. You didn't cross a line, and you didn't suddenly change. In fact, you stayed the same, and that sameness is what activated their fear. Your regulated presence challenged the core belief their nervous system was built around, the belief that closeness leads to loss. Being with you forced their body to feel something unfamiliar. Safety without chaos. And when a system isn't trained to tolerate safety, it will sabotage it to return to what it knows. That's why this experience feels so personal, even though it wasn't about your worth. You were placed in their life to expose a pattern, to show both of you what happens when a regulated nervous system meets one that's been surviving on distance. The heartbreak begins here, not because love failed, but because safety arrived before readiness, and the body chose survival over connection. If you're feeling the ache of that early bond, the confusion of how something so calm could lead to so much pain, it's because your nervous system is still trying to make sense of an unfinished cycle. You felt the connection forming at a level deeper than words. And when it started to slip away, your body registered it as loss before your mind could catch up. That's why this doesn't feel like an ordinary ending. It feels unresolved, suspended, like something meaningful was interrupted before it could fully exist. And that's exactly what happens when you're placed in an avoidance life at the wrong time, but for the right reason. So, as the connection continued, you may have noticed something that didn't quite make sense at first. The more grounded you became in yourself, the more distance began to appear on their side. This is one of the hardest truths to accept because it goes against everything we're taught about relationships. We're told that security brings people closer, that emotional steadiness creates safety. And it does, just not always in the way we expect. For an avoidant nervous system, your stability didn't feel like comfort forever. It felt like a narrowing of exits. When someone is used to regulating themselves through independence and emotional distance, another person's consistency can feel like a quiet demand, even when no demand is being made. Your calm presence removed the familiar emotional turbulence they unconsciously relied on to feel in control. Without that turbulence, their system didn't know how to orient itself. So instead of leaning in, it began to step back, not because you were unsafe, but because you were steady enough to matter. This is where the push and pull truly takes shape, and it's important to understand that this dynamic isn't confusion or manipulation, it's regulation. When they moved closer, their nervous system borrowed your calm. When they pulled away, they gave themselves space to breathe. This back and forth wasn't about power, it was about balance, their attempt to stay connected without tipping into overwhelm. You might have felt this as sudden warmth followed by unexpected coolness, engagement followed by silence, presence followed by emotional flatness. Each shift likely left you searching for meaning, wondering what you did wrong or what changed. What changed was internal. Their body was oscillating between the desire for connection and the fear of losing autonomy, and you were standing at the center of that tension without realizing it. At some point, they opened up to you in a way that felt significant. Maybe they shared something personal, something they don't usually say out loud. Maybe they softened, let you see behind the armor, allowed themselves to be emotionally present in a way that surprised even them. For you, this moment felt like confirmation. It felt like the connection was deepening, like the wall was coming down, and in a way it was. But what often follows vulnerability in avoidant attachment isn't closeness, it's shame. The exposure hits later, after the moment has passed. Their nervous system replays the interaction and interprets it as risk. I showed too much. I let someone too close. I lost control. That internal alarm triggers withdrawal, not because the vulnerability wasn't real, but because it felt dangerous once the protective adrenaline wore off. From the outside, this looks like an emotional shutdown. Conversations become shorter, affection fades, the tone changes. You may feel like you're suddenly talking to a different version of the same person, This is where neuroscience matters. When attachment activates threat pathways in the brain, the system prioritizes safety over connection. The avoidant nervous system has learned that distance reduces stress hormones and restores a sense of control. So withdrawal becomes the solution. Silence lowers cortisol. Emotional detachment restores equilibrium. It's not a conscious decision to hurt you, but it is a decision to self-protect at all costs. And because this process happens largely below awareness, there's often no explanation offered. They don't sit you down and say they're overwhelmed. They simply pull back, hoping the space will regulate them before anyone notices the shift. What's painful is that you noticed long before anything was said. Your body sensed the change. Humans are wired for attunement, and when you're emotionally present, you pick up on subtle cues most people miss: a delayed response, a change in energy, less curiosity, less warmth. Your nervous system registered the retreat even while your mind tried to rationalize it away. You told yourself you were overthinking, that nothing was wrong, that you should give them space. But the unease stayed. That's because attachment disruptions are felt somatically first. Your body knew something meaningful was slipping, and it reacted with anxiety, confusion, and a growing need for clarity. This is where heartbreak quietly deepens, not with a dramatic ending, but with unanswered questions. You may have tried to adjust to be easier, to take up less emotional space. You may have waited, hoping the loseness would return on its own. Meanwhile, their nervous system was settling into distance, finding relief in the very absence that was hurting you. This mismatch is devastating because both people are trying to regulate, but in opposite directions. You lean in for reassurance. They lean out for relief, and neither of you are wrong. You're just wired differently. The silence or emotional distance that followed wasn't empty. It was full of unspoken processes. Inside them, there was likely a mix of relief and loss. Relief that the pressure had eased. Loss, because the safety you provided didn't disappear emotionally, even when they pulled away physically or communicatively. This is the paradox of avoidant attachment. They can miss someone deeply while still maintaining distance. Their system compartmentalizes connection, allowing longing to exist without action. And this is why the lack of explanation hurts so much. You feel the bond didn't fully break, but it didn't continue either. It froze. From your side, the pain feels sharp because your nervous system is still trying to complete the attachment cycle. There was no clear rupture, no definitive ending, just a slow fading that left you suspended. You replay moments, searching for the point where everything shifted, wondering if something different could have changed the outcome. But the truth is, once their nervous system tipped into threat response, logic and reassurance couldn't pull them back. Distance had already become the solution. This is the neuroscience of the shutdown. The brain chooses what feels safest, not what feels most connected. Understanding this doesn't erase the hurt, but it reframes it. You weren't rejected because you lacked value. You were experienced as emotionally significant before they had the capacity to hold that significance. You triggered closeness in a system that learned early on that closeness comes with a price. And when the cost began to rise internally, they paid it by stepping away. This is why the heartbreak feels unfinished, like a sentence cut off mid-thought, because on a nervous system level, it was. What often hurts more than the distance itself is the absence of explanation. You're left standing in the quiet, replaying conversations, tone shifts, and moments that once felt meaningful, wondering why none of it was acknowledged. But avoidance doesn't disappear through dialogue. It disappears through disengagement. Explaining would have required them to stay emotionally present while naming fear, confusion, and internal conflict. And by the time you were looking for clarity, their nervous system had already exited. For avoidant attachment, silence isn't cruelty, it's a form of escape. Words would have pulled them back into emotional proximity. And proximity was the very thing their system was trying to regulate away. So instead of conversation, you were met with a vagueness. Instead of closure, you were met with absence. Not because you didn't deserve answers, but because answers require a level of emotional availability they didn't have access to in that moment. This lack of clarity is not neutral. It leaves your nervous system searching. Humans are wired to resolve emotional loops, and when a connection ends without definition, the body doesn't register completion. It stays alert, scanning for resolution, replaying memories as if understanding might soothe the ache. This is why the questions linger. Was it real? Did it matter? Could it have been different? These questions aren't weakness, they're biology. Your system bonded, and when the bond was interrupted without acknowledgement, it didn't know how to release it. That's why this heartbreak feels different from others you may have experienced. There was no clear rupture, only a slow emotional disappearance that left the attachment frozen in time. What makes this especially painful is that the connection itself never felt unstable. The instability came afterward. During the bond, there was a sense of depth, of being met, of something quietly forming. And then suddenly, the ground shifted. The emotional floor dropped out without warning. This kind of loss doesn't feel like rejection in the traditional sense. It feels like being erased from a story you were still living in. And because avoidant withdrawal often happens without confrontation, you're left holding the emotional weight alone. Their nervous system regulated itself by pulling away, while yours was left carrying both the connection and the confusion. It's important to say this clearly. You were not too much. You were not asking for more than was reasonable. You were asking for presence, clarity, and emotional continuity, things that feel natural to a secure or anxious system, but can feel overwhelming to an avoidant one the moment your needs became visible. Even subtly, their nervous system interpreted it as pressure. Not because you applied force, but because needs imply responsibility. And responsibility threatens autonomy, when autonomy has been the primary survival tool. So instead of meeting you where you were, they distanced themselves from the situation entirely. This isn't a reflection of your worth. It's a reflection of their capacity at that time. Understanding why you were placed in their life requires stepping back from the personal pain and looking at the pattern. You weren't there to fix them, to rescue them, or to prove that love could be safe if they just tried harder. You were there as an interruption. Your presence disrupted a familiar cycle, offering a different experience of connection, one that didn't rely on chaos, intensity, or emotional withholding. For an avoidant system, that kind of connection is both healing and terrifying. It reveals what's possible while simultaneously highlighting what's been avoided. You showed them a version of closeness that didn't demand self-abandonment, and whether or not they could integrate that experience, it left a mark. This is where many people get stuck, waiting for the return, hoping that once the fear settles, the connection will resume where it left off. And sometimes avoidants do return, not because they've fully healed, but because the memory of safety lingers. The nervous system remembers regulation even after distance is created. When stress rises elsewhere, when loneliness sets in, when the defenses soften, they may feel drawn back to the place where their body once felt calm. But return doesn't automatically mean readiness. Without deeper awareness and work, the same cycle can repeat because the underlying wiring hasn't changed. This is why reunion without growth often leads to a second heartbreak. What matters most is what this experience does to you. You don't walk away unchanged from being placed in an avoidance life. You leave with sharper awareness, even if it came at a cost. You learn to recognize the difference between emotional chemistry and emotional capacity. You become more attuned to consistency, to responsiveness, to the subtle signals that indicate whether someone can stay present when things deepen. This isn't bitterness, it's discernment. The pain you feel now is part of that recalibration. Your nervous system is updating its understanding of what feels safe, what feels secure, and what feels sustainable. The truth is, some connections aren't meant to last in form, but they're meant to last in impact. You were placed in their life not to be chosen in the end, but to expose a truth that couldn't stay hidden forever. For them, that truth was the cost of avoidance. For you, it was the realization that love without emotional availability will always feel incomplete, no matter how deep the bond feels initially. This doesn't make the experience meaningless. It makes it transformative. Heartbreak isn't always the result of something failing. Sometimes it's the result of something arriving before both people were ready to hold it. And if you're still sitting with the ache, still feeling the pull of what almost was, it's because your nervous system hasn't finished integrating the lesson yet. That takes time. It takes gentleness, and it takes the willingness to stop blaming yourself for someone else's fear of closeness. You were placed in their life to wake something up in them and in you. And once that awakening happens, neither of you can go back to the way things were before, even if the connection itself doesn't continue. What needs to be said now is something most people don't want to hear when they're still aching. Your role in their life was never to fix them, not to heal their attachment, not to teach them how to stay, not to prove that love could be safe if they just tried harder. You weren't the solution. You were the exposure. In neuroscience terms, you were the stimulus that revealed the wound. Healing only happens when the nervous system chooses it, and that choice can't be made on someone else's timeline. You showed them what regulated connection feels like, not through effort, but through presence. And once a nervous system experiences that level of safety, it can't unfeel it, even if it runs from it. That doesn't mean they'll suddenly become available. It means something inside them has been stirred, whether they acknowledge it or not. This is where a lot of people get trapped emotionally, holding on to the idea that because the connection mattered, because it was real, because it felt different, it must eventually come back together in the right way. And sometimes avoidant people do come back, not with grand realizations or full emotional accountability, but quietly. A message, a check-in, a reappearance that feels both comforting and destabilizing. This return isn't random. Avoidant nervous systems revisit what once felt safe when stress rises elsewhere. When life overwhelms them, when loneliness creeps in, when their usual strategies stop working, the memory of regulation pulls at them. Your presence left an imprint. But an imprint isn't the same as readiness. Without conscious work, without a willingness to face the fear beneath the distance, returning often means repeating the same cycle in a slightly different form. If they do return, it's important to understand what that moment actually represents. It's not proof that you were finally chosen. It's proof that safety was registered, and this is where your growth matters. Because the version of you that first met them was still learning what you could tolerate. You were still adapting, still holding space, still hoping consistency would eventually be met with consistency. But you don't come out of this experience the same. Heartbreak with an avoidant doesn't just hurt, it recalibrates. It teaches your nervous system to notice subtle misalignments earlier. It sharpens your awareness of what presence feels like and what absence costs you. By the time they return, if they do, you're no longer standing in the same place emotionally, and that changes everything. There's often a quiet grief in realizing that someone can care, can feel attached, can miss you, and still be unable to show up in the way you need. This grief is complex because it doesn't allow you to villainize them completely, but it also doesn't allow you to excuse the pain. You're left holding both truths at once, that they mattered and that they couldn't meet you, that the connection was real and that it wasn't sustainable. This is where many neither harden their hearts or overextend their compassion. The real work is staying soft without abandoning yourself. Recognizing that understanding someone's wounds doesn't mean volunteering to be wounded by them. What this experience begins to shift inside you is subtle but profound. You stop confusing intensity with intimacy. You stop mistaking potential for capacity. You start noticing how your body feels around someone, not just how strong the pull is. You become more sensitive to consistency, to emotional follow-through, to the way someone responds when things deepen rather than when things are light. This isn't you becoming guarded. It's you becoming regulated. Your nervous system learns that love doesn't have to be earned through patience or endurance. It learns that safety isn't something you wait for someone else to grow into. It's something you choose by aligning with people who already have access to it. And still, there may be moments when you miss them. Not the distance, not the confusion, but the version of them you saw glimpses of. The moments of presence, the calm, the sense of being understood without effort. Missing that doesn't mean you made a mistake. It means the connection touched something real in you too. But longing doesn't mean going back. Longing is just the echo of an experience that mattered. You can honor it without returning to the conditions that hurt you. This is one of the hardest lessons of this kind of heartbreak. You don't need to erase the meaning to move on. You just need to stop chasing the form it took. There's also something important happening on a deeper level. Being placed in an avoidance life often activates your own attachment patterns. It brings your needs, your fears, your tolerances into sharper focus. You may notice how quickly you adjusted, how much space you gave, how often you silenced your own discomfort to keep the connection alive. This isn't self-blame, it's awareness. Awareness is what allows you to choose differently next time. Not from resentment, but from clarity. You learn where your boundaries actually are, not the ones you thought you had. You learn how much ambiguity costs you. You learn that being emotionally attuned doesn't mean being endlessly flexible. If they never return, there can be a different kind of ache. One that wonders if you imagined the depth, if it mattered as much as it felt. But avoidant attachment doesn't erase significance just because it avoids expression. That what you shared existed in their nervous system, even if it never lived fully in words. That doesn't obligate you to wait or to hope. It simply means you can stop minimizing your experience to make the ending hurt less. You don't have to tell yourself it was nothing, it was something, and it changed you. This is the quiet turning point. The place where the story stops being about them and starts being about you. Not in a self-centered way, but in a grounded one. You begin to shift from asking why they couldn't stay to asking what you need to feel safe, chosen, and emotionally met. You stop measuring your worth by someone else's capacity. You start honoring your nervous system's need for consistency and clarity. This doesn't happen overnight. It unfolds gradually in moments where you choose yourself, even when part of you still feels pulled toward the familiar ache. By the time this phase integrates, you may notice something surprising. The charge around the connection begins to soften, not because it didn't matter, but because it no longer defines you. The unanswered questions lose some of their urgency. The memories still exist, but they don't grip your body in the same way. This is regulation returning. This is your system finding equilibrium again. And it's here that the meaning of why you were placed in their life becomes clearer, not as punishment, not as a lesson in suffering, but as a recalibration of how you attach, what you accept, and how deeply you're willing to stay aligned with yourself. What this experience ultimately did to you goes deeper than heartbreak. It didn't just hurt, it reorganized you. It changed how your nervous system understands connection, absence, and safety. Before this, you may have believed that if you stayed patient enough, understanding enough, calm enough, love would eventually stabilize. This connection quietly dismantled that belief. It taught you that emotional availability isn't something you earn through endurance. It's something someone either has access to or they don't. And no amount of empathy can substitute for capacity. This realization doesn't make you colder, it makes you clearer. You begin to feel in your body the difference between someone who can stay and someone who can only visit emotionally. That awareness stays with you long after the person is gone. You may notice that after this heartbreak, you're less willing to explain yourself repeatedly, less inclined to sit in ambiguity for extended periods of time. You still have depth, still have compassion, but it's no longer self-erasing. Your nervous system learned what it cost to bond with someone who retreats. When intimacy deepens, it remembers the quiet anxiety, the waiting, the internal negotiations, and now it gently guides you away from situations that recreate that feeling. This isn't avoidance, it's self-trust. You don't need intensity to feel alive anymore. You need consistency to feel safe. That shift alone marks profound growth. There's also a grief that surfaces when you realize how much you adapted without noticing, how you softened your needs, how you learned to read microsignals, how you stayed emotionally available while someone else stayed selectively present. Seeing this clearly can bring sadness, even anger, but it also brings power because once you see it, you can't unsee it. You start choosing connections that don't require constant calibration. You begin valuing people whose presence doesn't make your nervous system work over time. This is not settling. This is alignment. And here is the closing truth most people miss. You weren't placed in their life to stay. You were placed there to wake both of you up. For them, you were a disruption. Proof that closeness doesn't have to be chaotic, that connection can be regulating, that safety exists. Whether they ever integrate that lesson is beyond your control. For you, they were a catalyst. They showed you the edge of what you're willing to tolerate. and the depth of what you're capable of offering. They clarified your capacity for love and your need for reciprocity. That clarity is irreversible. Some connections end not because they weren't meaningful, but because they fulfilled their purpose. They arrive, they activate something essential, and then they dissolve, leaving you changed. This doesn't diminish what you shared, it contextualizes it. You don't have to chase closure from someone who couldn't stay present. The closure is already happening inside you as your nervous system settles into a deeper understanding of what real safety feels like. One day, you'll notice that the ache no longer dominates your inner world. The memories soften, the pull weakens, and in its place, there's a steadier sense of self. You're not hardened, you're grounded. You love with your eyes open now. You choose with your body, not just your hope. And when the right connection comes, one that doesn't retreat from depth, one that doesn't confuse calm with danger, it won't feel like anxiety or uncertainty. It will feel familiar in a different way, quiet, reciprocal, safe. That is why you were placed in an avoidance life. Not to lose yourself, but to return to yourself more regulated, more discerning, and more aligned than ever before.